Yeah, greetings and welcome to another of our PACM sessions. And today, being the first Sunday of the month, we have with us again Elder Cecil, who today will be looking at the Grenadian Revolution, a revision of it. But as usual, before we go into our main presentation, I'd like to hand you over to Ndugu Amani, who will be changing the mood for us.
Okay, asante sana ndugu Tahaka, shikamoo mzee Cecil, and hamjambo jamaa, which basically means greetings kindred, and welcome to the Pan-African Congress movement Umoja sessions, as ndugu Tahaka says, and also we're beginning the Black History Month, so this is all part of that celebration and notification. So we have one of our great historians in the UK to enlighten us into the title, as Ndugu Tahaka will explain, and so will MZ Cecil. So what I will do is start the ritual. So this is a ritual in order to change the vibration, because we are vibrations in one accord with the universal consciousness, and this is to get us into the right frame of mind and the right state of spirit. So if you wish to take part, please do. If you don't, African spirituality is not about coercion. Just feel free to just watch, and everything you'll see on screen. But first of all, what we're going to do to get us into the right state is control our breath, because breath is our link between the physical realm and the spiritual realm. It's that gateway. So what we're going to do is we're going to breathe deeply together. So what I'll ask you to do, if you wish to take part, is that you'll sit straight in your chair, if you're sitting in a chair, so that your spine is all in line, is straight. So your energy centers, 7 energy centers, are in line, and your feet are flat on the floor. Your hands are, your palm of your hands are on your thighs, and we're going to close our eyes. And we're going to do, first of all, is breathe out. But as we breathe out, we're going to pull our stomachs in as far as they could go, and that will expel the air. And then we're going to relax the stomach, and then that's going to bring in the air through our nose. So out through the mouth, in through the nose, and one cycle is one cycle of those that exit in inhalation and exhalation will count as 1. And I'll count it in Swahili. We'll do it 4 times, because 4 is the spiritual number for health. It's for growth, and it's for foundation. Okay, so if you join me, so close eyes. So first of all, we'll breathe out. So putting the stomach in, hold it, and relax. Breathe in, moja, and exhale, and relax. Breathe in. Mbili, and exhale. Pull the stomach in and relax stomach. Breathe in. Tatu. Breathe out. And now relax and breathe in. Good. So you should feel centered and start to feel going into a meditative state and calmer. And now, Ndugu, I'm going to share my screen.
Okay.
Yes, okay. Let me know when you can see that.
Right. That's up.
Okay, wonderful. Asante sana. So, mabadiliko ya nishati in Kiswahili means change of energy. So this is a ritual that we use in order to change that energy, as I said before. And what I'm going to do is going to just read through it, read through the presentation so you can follow. Some of it is in Kiswahili, some of it in Kemetic terms. So please just follow if you wish. So, mabadiliko ya nishati. To change energy, or vibration, we now thank the powers to ask that we have a closer connection with them and that they assist us in manifesting our objectives. And in order to change that vibration so that we become one with the universal vibration, the all, or wote in Swahili. And then by doing that, we become one and resonate with the area where we are in, and then be able to connect with consciously with the universal consciousness, and by that connect with each other wherever we may be in the world, so that we can be in one accord, even though we're not in the same physical space, but we share in the same spiritual space. So I will ring the triangle chime 7 times. 7 is the spiritual number for wisdom, seeking, and truth. And let the vibration go around you, over you, through you, and allow that connection with the space and with universal consciousness and each other. I'll begin. Continue to breathe deeply. Moja. Mbili. Tatu. Ine. Tana. Sita. Saba. Now, to thank the powers, we're going to use these words in Kiswahili, and it's call and response. So I say the first line, and then we all say in unison, we are one, or we are the same thing. But in Swahili, sisi ni kitu kimoja. So I begin. Ninaomba ya muumba awote. Sisi ni kitu kimoja. Ninaomba ya nebacha. Sisi ni kitu kimoja. Ninaomba kanuni na nguvu ya mami wata. Sisi ni kitu kimoja. Ninaomba kanuni na nguvu ya shu. Sisi ni kitu kimoja. Ninaomba kanuni na nguvu ya tefnut. Sisi ni kitu kimoja. Ninaomba kanuni na nguvu ya nut. Sisi ni kitu kimoja. Ninaomba kanuni na nguvu ya geb. Sisi ni kitu kimoja. Ninaomba kanuni na nguvu ya alset. Sisi ni kitu kimoja. Ninaomba kanuni na nguvu ya sebek. Sisi ni kitu kimoja. Ninaomba kanuni na nguvu ya heteru. Sisi ni kitu kimoja. Ninaomba kanuni na nguvu ya haru. Sisi ni kitu kimoja. Ninaomba kanuni na nguvu ya harakuti. Sisi ni kitu kimoja. Ninaomba kanuni na nguvu ya Maat. Sisini kitu kimoja. Ninaomba kanuni na nguvu ya saka. Sisini kitu kimoja. Ninaomba kanuni na nguvu ya tahuti. Sisini kitu kimoja. Ninaomba kanuni na nguvu ya ausa. Sisini kitu kimoja. Ninaomba kanuni na nguvu ya amen. Sisini kitu kimoja. So now we've called upon those powers that are at the basis of all existence, but also within our very psyches. And then we can now call upon the ancestors. And first of all, those ancestors who are in our direct bloodline. If not for them, we would not be here. And they are in our DNA. I'll begin. Ninaomba Ujime Kelly. Sisini kitu kimoja. Ndugu, is there anybody you wish to call upon?
Ninaomba Iceland Ratigan.
Sisini kitu kimoja. Ninaomba Bibi Ketra Reed. Sisini kitu kimoja. Anyone else you wish to call upon, Ndugu? That's fine. And so now we can call upon those ancestors who are not in our direct line, but have given their blood, sweat, and tears and effort to our communities, to our nations, and to our race. And if it's in our divine will, we will be able to emulate their works and even go surpass them. So, Ninaomba Mzee, the Honorable Marcus Mazar Garvey. Sisini kitu kimoja.
Ninaomba Helen Satori Jata.
Sisini kitu kimoja. Ninaomba wazee Amy Ashwood Garvey na Amy Jacques Garvey. Sisini kitu kimoja.
Ninaomba Sheikh Amadou Bamba.
Sisini kitu kimoja. Ninaomba Baba Barenge. Sisini kitu kimoja.
Ninaomba Baba Tagel.
Sisini kitu kimoja. Ninaomba Mzee Nanabonsu. Sisini kitu kimoja. Anyone else, Ndugu?
No, that's fine.
Okay. Okay. Ninaomba Mzee John Henry Clark. Sisini kitu kimoja. Ninaomba Mzee Winnie Mandela. Sisini kitu kimoja. And now we can call upon those ancestors who are not in our direct line, but whose names we don't always know. And first of all, those we should never forget and always remember, those who fought and died during Arabic enslavement, European enslavement, colonialism, and neo-colonialism. Ninaomba mababu ya Mangamazi. Sisini kitu kimoja. Ninaomba mababu ya Gula Vita, those who fought in the Gula Wars. Sisini kitu kimoja. Ninaomba mababu ya Asian Revolution. Sisini kitu kimoja. Ninaomba mababu ya APLA. Sisini kitu kimoja. Ninaomba mababu ya Freedom and Land Party. Sisini Kitu Kamoja. Babu ya Taifa la Kemet. Sisini Kitu Kamoja. Babu ya Taifa la Kaseti. Sisini Kitu Kimoja. And the first people on the face of the earth, Ninaomba Mababu ya Twa na Hutu. Sisini Kitu Kimoja. Ninawaomba wanaishi ambao watatetea sisi na wale mababu ambao bado hawajazaliwa. Sisi ni kitu kimoja. And we end on the words of power and the affirmation, and just repeat after me. Nguvu zote kwa watu wetu,
kwa watu wetu,
na mapenzi ya wote,
na mapenzi ya wote,
ni mapenzi yetu,
ni mapenzi yetu.
Okay, asanteni sana.
Okay, thank you very much, Asante sana, ndugu Imani.
There you go.
And now I'd like to turn to Elder Cecil, who will be doing today's presentation, and in terms of the Grenadian Revolution revised. Now I'll hand you over to Elder Cecil.
Thank you, my brothers, indeed. Thanks for the moving ceremony that we just went through. As you say, my brother, our topic today is the Grenada Revolution, which we are revisiting some 41 years after it occurred and some 37 years after it was brought down in the most extraordinary internal implosion following that and the invasion by the United States, forces of the United States that were waiting for an opportunity like that and had been planning for it for some time. Just in terms of personal connection, I had been, as a Caribbean activist, interested in occurrences in Grenada during the time prior the revolution. I had interviewed a friend of mine who ended up as the Grenada High Commissioner here in London, our brother Venice Augustine, while he was a lawyer here in London, and while he was an activist here in London, talking about the Guerra dictatorship and talking also about the history of Grenada. And on the first anniversary of the revolution, in fact, in March of 1980, I was proud to have been invited to be a guest of the revolution on its first anniversary in Grenada. So I actually did go to Grenada during the revolution. Now, independently of that kind of personal connection, the Grenada Revolution was an important event. It was the first time in what's the English-speaking Caribbean. Some people prefer to call it the Anglo-Creolephone Caribbean, because even though our language is formally, allegedly English, in most of the places we actually, in our day-to-day arrangements and contacts, speak one Creole or another, a native language that our people invented since being taken out of Africa to the Caribbean. So now, in that region, there had been, after so-called independence, flag independence, a whole series of dictators. And in Grenada, which is a small island of less than 200 square miles, with a population now of 112,000, something along those lines, and at the time just a little bit over 100,000. Incidentally, with about 4 times that number of Grenadans living out of the island, as is frequently the case with Caribbean territories, where if you go and check properly, you'll see that vast numbers of people who consider themselves seriously or tangentially Jamaican or Trini or Bajan or whatever, living away from their territories. So it's a small island in the Eastern Caribbean, and it has an extraordinary history. Like all other Caribbean territories, the first inhabitants were effectively massacred by a combination, not so much of the Spaniards, who didn't really get there, although they allegedly discovered it, but by the French and the British in the 16 and 1700s. And there's a place in Grenada called Leaper's Hill, which is famous, notorious as the place in which the original inhabitants of the island, or a big part of them, having fought in a significant battle with the French and lost, committed a mass suicide in that place. And if you go there, you will see that it lends itself to that kind of action, because a very steep drop down a hillside into the rocky ocean. So, and our African ancestors who were enslaved there resisted, and there's a history of resistance, including a well-known rebellion that happened in the 1790s. So it's a place with a typically Caribbean history, and with a pattern of resistance that continued into the period after emancipation, when resistance by ordinary people around wages, around labor conditions, and so on continued. And in the 1920s and into the 1930s, indeed all through into the 60s, there was a major movement in Grenada. It was Garveyite, anti-imperialist, anti-colonial, led by a man called Albert Marichaux, who in 1931 had, it is reputed, and probably accurately, about a third of the population of the island out on the street in a march protesting the then conditions of British colonialism there. So the Garveyite Marichaux movement is a good example of a pattern of Caribbean resistance. The fact that Marichaux had the people out throughout the 1930s had the effect, it is thought, and amongst those who think it, that the labor revolt, which occurred in almost every other part of the Caribbean, both British and French and Dutch, did not occur in Grenada in quite that way, because the people were in fact already mobilized against precisely the kinds of day-to-day oppression which were characteristic there and elsewhere in our region. So that from 1931 through the mid-1930s, and then into the late 30s, with Jamaica in 1938 being the site of the perhaps major revolt in the British part of the Caribbean region. And then the Second War came, and after that, everybody was clear that change was required, and generally speaking, the British introduced new constitutions, gave people who had been deprived of the vote, and after not a little while, gave countries independence of a sort. Independence which left our countries and people and our resources tied in neo-colonial arrangements to Britain or Holland, the Netherlands, or to France. Indeed, in some instances, they didn't even bother to give flag independence. The French territories, for example, are not independent territories. They tend to be departments of France, and some kind of similar arrangement applies with Suriname in relation to Holland. So that pattern of struggle against oppression continues in our region. We are the region where in 1958, the people of Cuba, having incidentally fought and liberated themselves in the latter part of the 19th century, both from enslavement and from Spanish power, found at the end of that war, beginning of the 20th century, that the Americans simply invaded, pretended to be fighting for their freedom against Spain. Remember that the Cubans had in fact already won their independence. So the American entry into that war was simply a ruse whereby they could take control of Cuba and Cuban resources, and they passed something called the Platt Amendment, which enabled the United States to say that the Cuban constitution could not be changed without the specific permission of the US Congress. So it was to overthrow the aftermaths and remnants of the dictatorships, a succession of dictatorships that were instituted in Cuba, that Fidel Castro fought successfully, first unsuccessfully, an operation that was directed at Moncada barracks, which failed, and he got a second chance going into the island on the Grama, almost disastrously, but after some years of struggle, winning the Cuban Revolution in 1958-59. So our region, as is actually quite widely recognized, is a region of people's resistance against oppression, the oppression in the form of enslavement, oppression in the form of colonialism, and now oppression in the form of neo-colonialism. So Grenada fits that pattern. And what was different about the Grenada Revolution in 1979 was that here was an Anglo-Creolephone territory in which its people succeeded in throwing off the dictator. It's not the first time that it had been attempted. In nearby Trinidad and Tobago, a set of young people who called themselves the National Union of Freedom Fighters actually organized an armed struggle against the Williams regime, but they were in fact wiped out. I won't say easily, but they were certainly wiped out. Early 1970s, 1972-3. So that was a failed armed effort against the Trinidad neo-colonial dictatorship. There was also an attempt broadly of that kind in Jamaica in the 1960s, in which, really the late 50s, in which a soldier or two or three were killed by forces that identified the Rastafari and so on. So the Guerra dictatorship now, his background matters. It matters that he was of the Grenadan people and soil. It matters that he went off as a migrant to one of the Dutch territories and worked there in the oil industry, learning whilst there certain techniques of struggle, certain techniques of trade unionism and so on, which were actually familiar in our region because trade unionism had been developing everywhere from the very early part of the 20th century and certainly came forward by leaps and bounds in the 1930s. But Geary had a rural workers and to some extent urban, we're talking about relatively small numbers in the urban areas of workers in his organization. And he took on the planter class and British colonialism and won. So Geary, before independence, became the leader of the Grenadan state. He was undoubtedly a dictator, undoubtedly brutal. He rigged elections, and this is not off the top of the head foolishness. It's very well documented. There was something called the Duffus Commission that documents the way in which he rigged elections, the way he beat up people. Maurice Bishop, who was the major leader of the revolution in 1979, his father was in fact killed, murdered by Guerra's forces during the previous decade. So oddly then, the armed overthrow of Geary had an extra justification because he was not about to allow himself to be toppled electorally, and the record of his frustrating such elective attempts to oust him is there documented. It matters too that those who approved and indeed carried out the revolution were in some cases already in the parliament. And it is said, almost certainly true, that Geary had left the island in early March of 1979 and left instructions for the leadership, who he had repeatedly had beaten up and so on. Frequently they had to be in hiding, even though, as I say, some of them were actually members of parliament. That he'd had left instructions for these people to be killed. So the move against him was preemptive, but it wasn't instantaneous. It had been planned, and I happen to know from my contact with the man who became their representative here in the UK that attempts were being made to get guns in through Union Island. And I learned recently from a text on Grenada by some people that I know that some Grenadan activists were trained in Guyana, they say by the Forbes Burnham regime. It sounds a little bit unlikely to me, but it could be true. The truth of the matter is that even though the people who carried out the Grenadan revolution were well prepared, they were not well prepared militarily. And it matters that they caught Geary's forces, especially those located in the military barracks at a place called True Blue. It was not well guarded. The very small number of NJM people were able to get in. Not only was it not well guarded, but Geary's soldiers were actually physically asleep, literally asleep. And so there was no armed opposition. The army was unable to resist because it had been caught literally napping. And then from there, early in the morning, the radio station was taken over. A message went out on the radio announcing what had occurred. People rose up because Geary was not popular, and advanced to police stations, persuaded policemen to come out to hand over their arms and so on. And that was the Grenada Revolution. Virtually no bloodshed, very popular. Geary had been discredited himself by the creation of a force called the Mongoose Gang that is best understood if we think of the Haitian Tonton Macoute. That is the kind of thing that it was. It was a brutal set of civilians, uniformed or not, willing to use violence against opposition to Geary, and including killing people. So that was the Grenada Revolution, and the preparedness of the revolutionaries is visible in the fact that they had ready for issue some legal instruments that they called Grenada's People Law 1, 2, whatever the number was. And these were issued on the first day of the revolution. They were organized and ready. It matters, therefore, that we acknowledge not just their preparedness for the revolution, but the fact that in the previous decade or so, the leadership tended to be people who were trained in law or something of that kind, or economics, right here in the UK, because Grenada had been a British colony, was in fact still a British colony at the time that we're talking about, and had gone back to Grenada and organized with a view to defeating Geary at the polls. I repeat that none of those efforts were successful because of the attitude of physical repression that characterized Geary's response to them. But these were very able men and women who led the Grenada Revolution, intellectually able and politically, ideologically sophisticated, seriously anti-imperialist, some of them seriously theoretically Marxist, and so on. Perhaps the most theoretically advanced of them was the man who became Deputy Prime Minister, Bernard Coard, who we in the UK were familiar with. He lived and worked here and was the author of a famous pamphlet called How the West Indian Child is Made Educationally Subnormal. But the real popular hero of the revolution and leader of it was Maurice Bishop. This is a picture of him here in his book, Maurice Bishop Speaks. So, the Grenada Revolution. They had a program. The program was to not go overboard for wholesale nationalization. They, in fact, only nationalized property belonging to Geary that had been illegally acquired by him, something like 5 or 7 hotels. And there was some other instances of nationalization, but those 1 or 2 instances took place in the context of the owners coming out in some way in conflictual opposition to the new revolutionary forces. What they were more concerned to do was a program of education, health, housing, a program of systemic and systematic development and redevelopment. This is a place where the incoming aid had been wasted. Under them, people had the skills to use rather than waste or steal the aid. They developed good relations with Cuba, with countries in Eastern Europe, with some Arab countries, and they sent the best and brightest of Grenadian young people to be educated in medicine or whatever in Cuba and engineering and elsewhere. So the revolution was well directed. They understood the need for effective physical communication with the outside world. On the first occasion when I went into Grenada, the only occasion, in fact, in 1980, we went in through a very small airport that couldn't take international aircraft. And one of the things that the revolution did was to set out to raise the resources, not just money, but other resources, to build an international airport, which obviously was intended to and did transform Grenada's communication with the outside world, opened up its domestic tourism industry and so on. Now, all of that means that the Grenada Revolution was an extremely and extraordinarily important event for the Caribbean people, consciously and unconsciously, and definitely consciously for Caribbean activists like myself. We, me personally, and other people like me, were enthralled that this revolution taking place in the part of the world where we come from, in the part of the world where neo-colonial domination had become the order of the day, and where answers to that were not easy and readily forthcoming. So we were inspired, excited by the Grenada Revolution. Like I say, I went there in 1980, taken as a guest of the revolution, and was much impressed by the quality of their presentation, the quality of their organization, the quality of their army. One of the striking things about the People's Revolutionary Army is that young men with locks, Rastafari is present throughout the Caribbean, and young male Rastafari in Grenada were fully supportive of the revolution, joined the army in significant numbers and so on, and that was visible. And lots of other things, exciting things, were visible in that moment of the Grenada Revolution. Anybody who's from the Caribbean knows that in the agricultural sector, stuff gets wasted, and especially, you know, you have a mango tree, and sometimes you have lots of them, and during the season, whole heap, and all you can do is give it away, and sometimes you can't even give it away. You sell it relatively cheaply, and the marketing of that kind of thing mattered. So one of the things that the Grenada Revolution did was to address agro-industrial activity, canning of fruit, export of fruit, and so on. I remember buying in London Grenadan Julie mangoes that were exported from Grenada and came out marketed by the Grenada High Commission here. So there was everything about that revolution to be thankful and grateful for, and we all were supportive of it and expecting it to survive. And in order for it to survive, it needed to be fully aware of the enemy internally and externally. And the key external enemy was the government of the United States. It matters that within a month of the revolution coming to power in March of 1979, that the US representative who was housed in Barbados came to Grenada to tell the revolutionaries that the United States government had grave doubts about them, that the United States government was ready and willing to give them $5,000 by way of aid, and in addition came to Grenada to tell the Grenadan leadership that they must make sure that they have no relation with Cuba. They must make sure that they do not emulate the then government of Jamaica, which is the Michael Manley government in its late stages, because by then the United States government, acting with the Jamaican ruling circle, had already effectively undermined the Michael Manley government. So it's not at all clear in terms other than purely ideological what they thought that any kind of alliance between Jamaica and so Grenada and the Manley government in Jamaica would achieve, but they warned them against it. And so the attitude of the government of the United States, the imperialist government of the United States, to the Grenada Revolution was made clear face to face by their representative to the leading personnel of the Grenada Revolution. So this, for 3.5 years, was a promising, challenging revolution. There were internal challenges. It needs to be understood that even though there was a pre-revolutionary movement that became the revolutionary movement with two groups united to form the new dual movement that became the revolutionary government, that they trained and politically trained, importantly, personnel was very limited, and extraordinary pressure was placed by that limitation in personnel numbers and competence on the competent leadership. There was also, as part of the moment, an issue of, given that this was an anti-imperialist revolution, seeking to move itself in more revolutionary and more specifically Marxist and Marxist-Leninist directions, that the effective formation and development of a effectively communist party presented a challenge. There's a question of whether you recruit popularly, whether you stage and manage recruitment and train people coming in before they come in, rather than training them after they arrive in the party. These were important problems and issues. It matters now that all of these years after the revolution, we have a full account by Bernard Coard of how the revolution came to the disastrous end that it did, and especially seeking to account for how it was that this tight group of revolutionary friends, men who'd grown up together, as it were, who'd been to study in London, if not quite together, but they were friends and close, how they came to end up at each other's throat. Now, it's important for me to say that the expression "at each other's throat" is used both metaphorically and actually, because on that October day in 1983, a significant part of the Grenada leadership, including Maurice Bishop and Jackie Creff, who was his partner and the ex-mother expecting his child, and who was, as I say, Minister of Education, and some others, as many as 7 of that part of the leadership were killed. Nobody knows how, nobody knows exactly by whom, and I actually believe the account supplied by the people who were falsely accused by the government of the United States, who ran a kangaroo trial and convicted them, and in fact sentenced them to death, and then that was commuted, but they spent a long time in jail. And there were those in the Caribbean and outside who believe, for example, and actually specifically, that Coard and his colleagues, in a moment of political, ideological disagreement, ended up ordering the death of Maurice and those who were killed in that way. Incidentally, I'm going to come back to that. I believe the account of what happened given by Coard and some others of those who survived all of those terrible years in prison after the conviction, false conviction. There was no viable evidence. Now, how did we get to that? Here is a revolution that knows that there is an external enemy, that knows that there has to be preparation. And why is preparation not just ideological, but armed, physical, military preparation? The United States government, as I said, within a month of the revolution, was warning the revolution not to go in a certain direction. And in fact, the revolution did go in that direction. That is to say, it went increasingly to the left, against the warning of the United States of America. And right from the start, the United States government actually considered and then rejected the idea of putting a flotilla around Grenada to coordinate off and to stop imports and exports and to starve the revolutionary government into submission. That was something they thought about in 1979 and failed to do, but it didn't stop them preparing longer term for overthrowing the government. Now, the fact that the Cuban Revolution survives is to do with the fact that it's an island and that it's an actually well-defended island, and that the Americans, if they were to invade for a second time, would have much more difficulty than they did on the first occasion of the famous Bay of Pigs, when the American government supported and armed certain forces that actually attempted to overthrow the Cuban government, ending up in disaster. So if Grenada was to survive, it knew that there was a threat of invasion. It knew that the Americans were practicing carrying out exercises near Puerto Rico. They called one of their major exercises Operation Amber and the Ambergins, which is very close to Grenada and the Grenadine Islands, and two small islands of Grenada are in fact in the Grenadines, Carriacou and Petit Martinique, and some others in fact. So, and as a consequence of that awareness of the physical threat of the United States, as well as the ideological threat, the Grenada people armed themselves. There was a militia. The militia was well trained. It was constantly on exercise and so on. It matters, and Coard is very clear about this, that he was sent to the Soviet Union representing the Grenada government to seek arms for self-defensive purposes from the government of the Soviet Union. Coard tells a story, and it's actually almost amusing. He says that he made the representation to the military people appointed by the government of the Soviet Union to deal with them. That these people listened to him and his delegation, and then they came back and said, if that is really your problem, namely the threat of invasion from the United States of America, then what you're actually asking for isn't enough by any means to organize and to be the basis of your physical self-defense. So we are going to send you much more than you're asking for, and we are going to send it via Cuba. So it's extraordinary and amusing. And Coard tells the story, as I say, that those arms were sent. The Grenadian government, and they ended up in Cuba and indeed most of it remained in Cuba. And the reason for that, and Coard says so, is and was that the Grenada armed forces, both the army and the militia, were not yet ready and trained to use the range and type and power of equipment. And so, to repeat, much of the military materiel required on the basis of the Soviet Union's assessment of what was required for that defense never was in Grenada. And that is something they were training to receive, but it was going slowly, and it, repeat, never got there. Now, importantly, as will be the case even in the most well-run social circumstances and social organizations, there will be difficulty. We're talking about a small Caribbean island. We're talking about a group of friends and associates at one level, serious revolutionaries, but also a group of friends and associates who have children, who have wives and have to handle domestic issues, have to handle childcare, that pose difficulties. They have implications for discipline and so on and so forth. And they ended up in a situation where Coard is very definite about the extent to which there were failures of that kind at the highest level within the revolution. He complained, and says he complained repeatedly to the powers that be within the revolution, that promises were made which were not kept, and that this is not so much about ideology, although the ideological dimension is there, and I will come to it. That promises were made which were not kept, and there came a moment when he, Bernard, resigned from one of his major offices within party and government. He had two, because he was so fed up with the failure of some, including Morris, the leader, a very popular leader. Bernard was never popular. Bernard had support, and the support that he had was amongst trained young men within the party and within the army who valued and idolized almost his Marxist competence and discipline. So, and it may well have been the case, there is some evidence for that, that within the party and government, some moves were being made that amounted to the creation of a sub-formation kind of loyal to Bernard within the party structure. We'll leave that to one side because I don't necessarily think that that's where the problem arose. So we have a situation where Morris is popular. Morris is being said to be liable to and the subject of repeated failings, which are known because they have been brought to the attention of the Central Committee and the executive, and there's almost the same set of people. And nothing changes. Bernard, with this big reputation, well-based reputation, resigns and is waiting in the wings. And there comes a moment in the middle of 1983 when there is perceived to be a crisis. The components of the crisis are not all that well specified anywhere, although if you want an account of what the crisis was, you will find it well articulated in Bernard Coard's book. There are at least 2 volumes of his account of what went wrong in Grenada, why it happened, why as it did. So in this crisis moment for the party, which is trying to build and can't make a clear decision about how to build, does it build popularly this repetition, or does it train cadre and bring them in slowly, whilst recognizing that if you do the latter, the work that has to be done by the party, which feels that a crisis precisely around that work is occurring, but you can't bring the people in quickly enough to perform the work. And if you bring them in on a speedier pace, you're bringing in people who are politically untrained and untrained in other serious respects. So it's a real and genuine problem. So it is in that moment of crisis that the party meets. A very set of meetings happen, and at one of them, it is agreed by what is effectively the Communist Party of Grenada that there will be joint leadership of Morris and Bernard. What nobody ever took a point around, and it actually matters, is that a question arises. I know that Bernard has a perfectly credible explanation for why he resigned from the big position that he resigned from. But questions arise as to the propriety, political propriety of that, given the stated basis on which it was done, and given the opening that it provided for accusations to be leveled at those who had occasioned, if you will, the resignation, and also the opening that it provided for relief and expectation and even principled movement around bringing Bernard back as part of the solution to the crisis in the party, part of which is being said to relate to certain lack of discipline and certain underdevelopment around personal conduct of the very popular leader, Maurice Bishop. So the party meets. There is great excitement, and the decision is made that a key part of the solution to this crisis, leave aside whether it's correct or not as a judgment, but the decision was made by the party to bring back Bernard, and not just into the original situation, but now for there to be a joint leadership. And this was thought and said at the time to be likely to have the effect of strengthening the party, since the popular, charismatic, high speaking skills, popularity with the people, massive communication, openness right down to the bottom of the society would be combined with Bernard's strength, which was theory and organization. This is a man who ran the economy with extraordinary skill. I heard him in the time I was there in March, April of 1980, setting out repeatedly and expertly how he and the party, with him leading that side of the enterprise, was tackling the economics of the island on their new revolutionary perspective. Now, communist parties operate on the basis of a principle called democratic centralism. That is to say, there is debate within the party, and once a decision is taken, those who disagree with it and those who agree with it have to obey it and follow it. No exception to that rule. And in circumstance after circumstance, people get shot for undermining or betraying the principle of democratic centralism. So the decision had been taken. There was a democratic centralist duty on Maurice and all of the others to abide by it. And Maurice had agreed, and it matters that he'd agreed. And yet, he seems to have had some kind of a change of mind. And that is an offense of a serious kind within a communist regime, which is what the Grenada leadership and revolution had transformed itself over the previous 3 years or so, 3.25 years into. So, the party leadership put Maurice under house arrest. He'd been out of the island when he came back. That happened. And if you read Coard's account, it's very clear that personality and ideology were now being seriously mixed up and combined, that factionalism was developing on a rampant basis, and that issues between now Bernard and his faction, and that faction had the majority in the party, and Maurice, who had friends, old friends and allies. Bernard represents them as the harbors and harbingers of the indiscipline that he had complained about for a quite long time. Nevertheless, factions they now were. And the factionism had to be played out no longer within the ambit solely of the party, but out in public, because you cannot put a popular leader, whatever his offense within the party, under house arrest if the leader is genuinely popular, because, as happened in Grenada, the people are going to come out and rescue him from the wicked majority in the high party leadership who have made the mistake of arresting and trying to oust the leader, which is exactly what happened. So the Grenada Revolution ended up in a crisis generated in broadly the terms that I have set out. Bernard makes a number of points which worry me. One of those worrying points is that he is not above blaming the Cubans for what happened, for misadvising Morris and for interfering improperly on his account in the affairs of Grenada and its revolution. I cannot say that I either believe or am comfortable with that part of Bernard's account, nor am I comfortable with his claim around the notion that there was a Cuban military contingent present in Grenada. There really wasn't. The major contingent of Cubans in Grenada were medics, teachers, and airport industrial workers. Now, all of those people are militarily trained, because every Cuban citizen has military training, and sometimes it can be quite high-level military training. So it is true that the labor squad building the airport was comprised of people who knew their way around weapons and had some small amount of weaponry for self-defense, but this was not, not a military contingent. And it is a misrepresentation to argue that it was, as Bernard does. And I believe also that he's wrong. The big brother, big revolutionary comrade, and I have to be humble when I say this, but I do not accept his story that Fidel's Cuba interfered and misled Morris into trying to be the Fidel of the Grenada Revolution, which is effectively the charge that Bernard lays against Fidel and Morris, and I do not accept it. The Cuban Revolution wasn't like that anywhere in the world, didn't behave like that anywhere in the world, and it's certainly, in my view and on the evidence that I think I have, behaved like that in Grenada. So the cause of the implosion has to be looked for within the social, personal, political relations within the New Jewel movement, within the People's Revolutionary Government, and within the structures, including the army, that constituted the leadership of the revolution. It is they who fell out amongst themselves for reasons which they should have been able to manage, and it is they who, as a result of falling out amongst themselves, hadn't bothered or paid sufficient attention to training military people so that the arms that the Soviet Union had given could be in Grenada and usable by Grenadans in Grenada when the invasion happened. It is their fault that because of the implosion and because of the leadership's fear of the popularity of Morris, that there was a certain unwillingness, this is my reading, there's a certain unwillingness to arm the people. And so the effectively trained militia was not, in fact, in my understanding of the matter, called out. And the arms, which should have been in the hands of the militia, were not in the hands of the militia because of the context or fear of the people arising from the move by the party against its own leader, who, in their terms, and probably rightly, was said to have broken a key, violated a key party principle, namely democratic socialism. So the masses rescued Morris from house arrest, conveyed him to the military headquarters. At the military headquarters, nobody knows what happened. There was confusion. Shots were fired. The masses who were up there scattered, jumped over, and were killed in numbers. A precipice, sheer drop down concrete and onto to rocks. So many people died and were injured. And it's in that confusion that Morris and Jackie Creff and at least 5 other leaders of the revolution were killed, murdered. Incidentally, Morris's body has never been found. Clearly, the Americans know where it is and have used that as part of the way in which they justified the invasion and the aftermath, and the way in which they used false, genuinely false evidence against the majority leadership of the People's Revolutionary Government in the moment of that bust up and then the invasion. What else can one say? And this matters, just as the Grenada Revolution was important because of what it was and because of where it took place, because it took place first successfully in the Anglo-Creolephone Caribbean, the British Commonwealth Caribbean, a successful revolution against a neo-colonial dictatorship, and by people who were calling themselves anti-imperialist and Marxist anti-capitalists. So it was exciting to people of my ilk, and it was also exciting to other people because they were race nationalists. The majority of that leadership in that place were African black people, and Morris and others spoke that language inside and outside of Grenada to African Americans, to Black British people here. I heard him speak wonderfully at Kensington Town Hall, which is down the road from where I am sitting at this moment, and so on. And I heard him speak also in those terms to Africa and to the Arab world from within Grenada, both on the occasion when I was physically there and others. So the loss of the Grenadian Revolution, in the circumstances in which it was lost, not because of American invasion, you have to expect those, and you have to prepare at least to try to beat them off, and not to wound yourself and disable yourself in relation to that inevitable, almost, conflict. So, because this particular revolution, given its race, class, and gender disposition, failed in the way it did, that represents a blow to the heart of socialism in the Caribbean, from which, in fact, Caribbean socialism has not recovered. It's known, isn't it, just how popular the revolution was. It's known that lots of left intellectuals had gone there and were doing this and that and everything in support of this revolution. And after it, in the circumstances in which it fell apart, with socialist African Marxists and socialist African nationalists murderously at each other's throat, effectively at least being able to say that the guns had been turned on the people, that many of those people that I just briefly described, Caribbean left intellectuals, men with university careers that they had abandoned, the PhD programs that they had abandoned, went back into their academic niches, from which you cannot, even to this day, see them re-emerging with any revolutionary fervor, any revolutionary program, any revolutionary activity. And that's just one way in which this outcome has manifested. It is undoubtedly a massive tragedy for socialism worldwide, and certainly for the nature and future of socialism in our Caribbean region. That is what I think I want to say.
Muting myself. Yeah, thank you very much, Elder Cecil. Yes, so now we'll open up
I want, if I may, to do something that I was remiss in not doing. The leadership of the Grenada Revolution, I mentioned Jackie Kreff, but a towering female figure in that revolution, Mrs. Coard, died recently, and her contribution to that revolution inside of the revolution and after was really massively significant. She spent years suffering very harshly on the hill in Grenada, and they only let her out when she had a cancer, which eventually took her in only recent months. So I want to pay special tribute to Mrs. Coard. I have her book with me here, and I just want to draw it to people's attention. Get hold of Phyllis's book. She just passed, a significant Caribbean woman, a major contribution to the revolution, principled, dedicated, just gone. And her book is called Unchained, A Caribbean Woman's Journey Through Invasion, Incarceration, and Liberation. Phyllis Coard. Available, not all that expensive. And her husband's books need to be read, as do Morris's, whose speeches are available in at least 2 collections. This is one of them.
All right. Yeah, so now the floor is open. So any questions and comments, just please post them, and we'll pass them over to Elder Cecil to discuss. Looking nothing so far. So in the meanwhile, while people are gathering their thoughts,
not often so,
bringing their questions, there's a couple of points here that are noted. One of the things that strike me, which I don't know how widely known it is, or if it is known, the involvement of the Soviet Union in terms of, as you say, I think it was Bernard Coard met with them, and what he was asking for, they told him he needed a lot more than that. So you said the equipment was actually in Cuba, or was delivered to Cuba?
To Cuba by the Soviet Union. one shipload. I don't know how many shiploads, but unless some of it got to Grenada. And I repeat, Bernard tells the story. He tells it very well. It's almost amusing because he says that he makes this presentation to the Soviet generals and politicians, and they hear his presentation. I don't think they respond instantaneously. They send them away, and then they call them back to say, this situation that you're in, that you're describing, requires you to have a much more powerful, wider range of weaponry than you're actually asking for, and we are ready to give it to you. They sent it, and what Bernard says, as I understand his account, is that the reason it ended up in Cuba was that it was en route through Cuba to Grenada, and there's a long moment during which the Grenadans knew that they weren't yet ready with the training and so on, or even the size of their military forces to deal with this equipment. So much of it never arrived in Grenada. This is from Bernard. Yeah.
Okay. And the other point is right. I'll just do them in order that I put them as you were speaking. So one of the things that struck me with the leadership, you several times you used the word communists. They were communists. It was basically a communist regime.
Yes.
Now, in terms of a Pan-Africanist, would you say there was any aspect of Pan-Africanism within that regime?
Is that your question, or you adding anything?
No. Yeah, that's the kind of question I'm trying to tease. I'm trying to tease out, because I remember when I first came across, say, Maurice Bishop, for example, I, at the time, consider him more of a Pan-Africanist than, say, a Marxist.
Yeah. No. Okay. Remember that I dealt briefly in my remark with that matter. There are speeches of Morris where he's talking about Marichal, the Garveyite leader in Grenada, long before him, decades before him. Actually, Marichal survived into the 70s, if my memory is serving me right. He talks about Garvey. He talks about the fact that the Grenada population are overwhelmingly African, like himself, right? In appearance. That because of that, they have an appeal to Black America. They have an appeal to Africa, and so on. So I think that Morris, like me, and putting myself into high company, like Walter Rodney, managed, in my view, effectively to combine a Pan-African awareness and spirit of Pan-African liberation and consciousness with using seriously Marxist theory and ideology. And I see that in the Grenada Revolution. That's why Rasta youth were comfortable in the service of the Grenada Revolution. I said in my talk that you can see pictures from 79, 80, and young men with locks are in the army. Nobody required them to cut their locks to be soldiers and so on. And they were fervent. I spoke to some of them in 80 in support of the revo, as they called it. So this was a combined race and class revolution. The oppression that the Grenada people had gone through was oppression that was related to both their race and their class. And the leadership, certainly Maurice Bishop and many others of them, never backed off bringing forward those two elements. Class, Marxism, therefore, and race, Africa, blackness, Garvey, Marichal, on the other side. And that's my view of it. It also, and this matters too, they didn't start off the New Deal movement and the People's Revolutionary Government as obviously a Marxist government. They were anti-imperialist right from the start, and so on, and that was in their ideology. But as the running of the country and the terms on which they should run the country came more and more into fore, and as the nature of the entity that was the revolutionary government and revolutionary party came to be addressed, that pushed them more and more into orthodox Marxist approaches to party formation and party organization and the recruitment of militants. And that's where the idea that I brought up of democratic centralism arises, because by the middle of 1983, they now had a party, a communist party, and the rules and principles that govern that were beginning to be applied, which is why Morris got into trouble, because having agreed to the joint leadership within the party, and it becomes a party policy, you can't go back on that without violating the party principle. And that's why the majority of the party, who loved him, right, nevertheless put him into house arrest and were in the process of ousting him. But because of his popularity, which I don't think they factored effectively into their way of handling the crisis, the people just went and rescued him, and then things boiled over and exploded, and guns couldn't be given to the militia because, you know, armed people might be supporting Morris and so on. So the push of events in the Marxist direction, that happened in Cuba as well. When Fidel came to power, he wasn't in the Communist Party of Cuba. That's a completely different entity. And it was in the context of the fight against American imperialism and the continuing struggle against the internal supporters of capitalism and reactionary US lines that you get Cuba gradually becoming what it now is, which is a communist country with a communist party, seriously so, and so on. That happened over time. Yeah. And the same thing was happening in a way with, and even in Cuba, the race element, even though they have problems with it because of their history and because of the race of most of the leadership, they have problem with blackness. But Fidel is very serious about Cuba being an Afro-Latin country. And he doesn't say it often, but the majority of people there are black people. and it's out of that country with that Afro-Latin commitment that he sent troops to Angola, unlike the Algerians in the north of Africa who promised and never sent anybody.
Okay. All right. There's a few questions coming in. Okay, I'll put the first one. And that's by Shakara. If you can see it.
Yes. Well, like I say, Morris, in his speeches, which are in at least 2 books, but anytime you pick up, and a lot of it is on YouTube, Morris Bishop speaking, here in Grenada, in the United States of America, which are the 3 places that I see him speaking, he's always talking about the Garvey, about Garvey at Marichaud, about the blackness of and Africanness of the Grenada population, and so on. And he set up relations with African revolutionaries, both in North America and on the continent of Africa. And it is to those people that our young brother Shakara is drawing attention. So he had good relations with all of the contemporary radical African leaders.
Okay. There's another point here about Shakara. What I'm doing, I'm going to pose the question in order that I received them.
Okay, no problem.
So there's another one here. Is Brother Shakara here? I think he's pointing out a speech given by Maurice Bishop at an LD observation. That's just reinforcing the fact that he was very African conscious.
Yes, there is no doubt about it. I repeat, this was a revolution carried out by and on behalf of the African population of Grenada. There are next to no white people there. There are a few Indians, but it's a black place. Even, actually blacker than Jamaica in terms of its actual population. And Morris was aware of this. This is fundamental to their history, and in his political presentations all over the world, but certainly in the English-speaking world, he's always speaking about those matters.
Okay. Again, Shakara, and this question, can you see it's about the Rastafarian became disillusioned basically with the revolution due to ill treatment.
I was there in 1980, and in 1980 I went all over the place. I spoke to all kinds of people, and amongst the people I spoke to were Rastafari inside of the army and Rastafari outside of the army. And I discovered only support for obviously the people in the army had joined the army, which had changed after the revolution. So these people were supporters. There might have been, and to deal directly with Shakara's point, I am not aware that there was a process of disillusionment by those very people that I saw being and spoke to, being enthusiastic in 1980, 1 year into the revolution, with them becoming disillusioned over the next 2.5 years. I'm not aware of any such evidence. There could have been some. There might have been arguments about weed and so on. And the Grenada government did have an argument with a set of men who weren't Rasta at all, who were they're Bultlal brothers. They were actually Indian, and they got into trouble with the government over weed selling. So there might have been a little of that, but I have no information to the effect that Rastafari, who supported the Grenada revolution and who joined the army in significant numbers, I visually saw and spoke to them in 1980, came to be disillusioned by bad treatment that was meted out to them by the government or the army. I'm not aware of that.
Okay. And another one coming up also by Shakara. It's talking about the ideological differences within the parties. In terms of hardline Marxists and slightly less hardline Marxists, nationalists.
It's difficult to know how to deal with that, because in retrospect, and given that factions did develop towards the end, and also given that these things have been articulated in those terms, it's clear in retrospect that was a factor. That's my first point. My second point is that I knew Richard Hart quite well. And Richard says, he was there as their Attorney General, that he was unaware of any internal factionalism. So if you read, and it matters that we do, Bernard's account, Bernard never says that the issue was ideology.
he says that the issue was discipline. He says that Morris had a tendency to be insufficiently disciplined and to make commitments that he didn't carry out effectively, that he, Bernard, complained, the party heard the complaint and did nothing about it, or didn't have the means to do anything about it, and that he, Bernard, resigned and then came back. And when he came back and was brought back with the party saying now joint leadership, it's not an argument in terms of ideology. It's an argument in terms of discipline, organizational discipline, and Bernard being said to be strong in a certain way, and Morris being said to be strong in another way, and how those two strengths could do nothing but enable the party to move forward on a better basis. That's how the argument was in reality. Outside of that immediate context, and I knew people who were part of it, including, I don't know if I should mention her name, a famous Grenadian novelist who was in Grenada and a party to these arguments and discussions at the time. And it wasn't about ideology in that sense. It was about the crisis that the revolution is in and how we can bring together forces that, when combined, will strengthen the party and the party management of the revolution in a more effective way. So that's my answer. The other part of my answer is that outside of Grenada, people who, for whatever reason, disliked Bernard and preferred Morris, then characterized him as this hardline Marxist who was wanting to drive the party in the direction of hardline Marxism. In fact, the whole party was committed to being more effectively Marxist in its management and its ideology than it had been. And that's part of what the crisis was about. And they were all committed in that way. It's just that some people were being said to be less disciplined than they should be, and some people were being said to be more disciplined and more on the program than others. And more Bernard's quality, for some, was his ideological competence, but his much more important competence was the way in which this man, with family difficulties, he talks about them in the book, childcare responsibilities and so on, nevertheless managed to be completely disciplined in relation to his party and governmental work, and wished others to be up to that standard. And so I don't see even him saying that the disagreement was between hardline and softline Marxists, and that's what the thing fell apart over. Although the argument can be made and has been made, I don't accept it.
All right. There's another question, but I've seen a notice here. Shakara's, he's got a lot of questions. So he's suggesting, he's suggesting, if you don't object, could he actually bring him in and he can join the panel?
I absolutely don't object. I love you.
Okay. So Shakara, if you listen to me, if you want to join the panel, just type number 4 for me to let me know, and then I'll send the link. I'll stick the link in the thing so you can come in. And if you don't, all right, if you don't want to join the panel, just type 3.
I mean, I hope he does come in. And while that is happening, if there's no other question, let him ask as we go along.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, well, I'm looking at he brought up another question here.
Yeah.
And oh yeah, there's another question. Where does the
Line of betrayal lie?
lie?
And who should be called to account? That's a
Okay.
complicated question. All right.
All right. So I'm going to bring him in. He says yes. So
yes, man.
What I'm going to do, I'm going to post the link.
Yeah, I'll answer the question in the meantime. And
I'm going to post the link in the comment box, Shakara. So it's just for you. So just click on it and come straight in.
And then after he does, you better take it back down because others might use it.
Yes, I know. I've posted the link. So just press on that. You should.
Okay. Yes. Now, Brother Shakara, correctly, he says, where does the line of betrayal lie? And who should be called to account? And then he says a complicated question. And it absolutely is complicated, but so we've got to deal with it in a proper manner. Now, clearly people were killed in Grenada. 7 of the leadership died on that day in October 83. And many ordinary civilians who'd gone up to the fort when an army half-track fired its machine gun, enough people jumped over a wall, and on the other side of that wall was a sheer drop down concrete onto rock, and people were injured and died. Okay, so in those circumstances, it's correct that people say somebody must be to blame. What is more, the Americans decided that the majority of the party leadership who had passed a decision putting Morris into house arrest were also responsible for giving the order to kill him, and he was killed. So the question is, did that part of the leadership, who were by that time the majority of the party people, were they responsible for his death directly by giving an order to do so? There is no good evidence for that. And because it is something that interested me right from the beginning, nobody wanted Morris killed. I love Morris Bishop, right? And I knew how brilliant Coard was, but he wasn't my favorite person in any way. So that outcome really wasn't welcome, and I was prepared to condemn if there had been any credible evidence that I saw the people who were responsible, if there was evidence of their direct responsibility in terms of giving an order, not in terms of putting him under house arrest and causing the ruckus, which ended up with people, the masses where in principle they shouldn't be in a military post, and then leadership being killed, 7 people, in cold blood, and enough more jumping. So because of that, I have been keen personally to hear accounts by those who were involved. And the best account that I have, apart from Morris's detailed one, and before Morris gave his, was, and you were there, my brother, was from Strawn, Selwyn. And I accept what Selwyn says. And there is no good evidence on the basis of which to contradict that or to reject it. And so that's where I stand. So the blame lies with the fact that all of them together mismanaged the situation with the consequences that included people dying completely unnecessary, jumping off that place, the leadership, a big part of the leadership being killed by God knows who, probably by American agents, I don't know, and because they needed deaths in order to justify justify what happened and so on. So it's in something like that position that I stand. There is no evidence that Coard and the majority, including Hudson Austin, the army general, who was temporary head of the People's Revolutionary Government, ordered the killing of anybody.
10-1. I just want to say thank you for allowing me to join. I have like a whole heap of questions, and some of them are better. They're just better relayed in vocally rather than.
Welcome.
Welcome.
You know I love you from you were so high.
I appreciate. In relation to this last question, I'm interested in your thoughts on the dichotomy between the will of the people on the one hand and the will of the party on the other. And if a decision is made in the party that seems to go against the will of the people, is it who should be called to account? Because if Bishop has the will of the people, is seen to be representing the will of the people, and the party is seen to be representing another interest, that line seems to be very blurry to me, and not one that we can really. You just know what I'm saying? Because on the one hand, sorry, I explain it like this. On the one hand, you could say, well, Maurice Bishop is incorrect, for going against the decision that was made in the party. And that is it's a position that I have sympathy with. But at the same time, when he's under house arrest and the people themselves go to liberate him, how do you...
The party's in trouble at that point.
Yes.
Right?
You know what I'm saying?
Right. So in my view, Maurice Bishop, sorry, not Maurice, but Bernard made a mistake for which he was never called to account and from which he benefited.
Right.
Withdrawing from one of his positions, sitting fuming, letting people know why he's sitting fuming, and then in a moment confined within the party, being brought back as part of the salvation of the party, which sees itself importantly. And this has to be understood because we have to know what's motivating people. The people in the party, they're in the party. They both are the people and they're the party. And what they're trying to do, because they think and know that the interest of the people is represented by the party, and what they're trying to do is bring about a situation which the party can deliver the revolution and the benefits of the revolution better to the people. And when they say joint leadership, that's what they're trying to achieve. Excepting that because of how Bernard had handled it, he, instead of anybody asking, but Brother Bernard, you can't really resign and just sit out there and complain. Although before he resigned, he was complaining. So he didn't resign and then complain. He resigned because complaining within the structure wasn't achieving the desired outcome because, quote, the discipline on the part of some of the leadership wasn't where it should be. So two errors are made. That's the first one, which the party doesn't deal with. And it deals with him to Bernard's advantage. It deals with it to Bernard's advantage because this brilliant man, and he is undoubtedly brilliant, is sitting out there, and what the people in the party need is for him to be back in, and not just back in the old way, but back in as joint leadership. Now, he performs a trick in his book, which I reject. And this trick is that he says there was actually nothing unusual about joint leadership because joint leadership had been characteristic of the Grenadian revolutionaries long before they became revolutionaries, from the days of the New Jewel movement and when they came together in the structure that formed the New Jewel movement. Now, that is true, but that's not what was being proposed on that occasion in the middle of 1983 when they said joint leadership. Maurice was being effectively demoted. Bernard was being elevated. And the dynamic of the situation was that inevitably Bernard was going to use the new power to enhance his position and do down Morris. So the balanced the balanced notion of joint leadership that is a historic feature of Grenadian left politics wasn't what was actually being promoted when they said joint leadership and made a party decision to that effect. And that's what Morris had difficulty with. Now, he shouldn't have gone ahead with it, but so close and respectful were they that he knew what Bernard was bringing back and wanted it. It's just that the terms that Bernard was able to extract, make me joint leader, was one term too much, but he agreed to it. Yeah. But back to your question, because I haven't really answered it. So, although I have in a way. So, it's not that the party was pushing an interest that was other than the people's. It is that they were trying to advance the people's interest. Joint leadership, in their view, represented that. But Morris, having agreed to it and then gone back on it, effectively violated a very important party principle. They really should have looked at the situation better than they did, because I repeat, Morris was loved, not just ordinarily popularly loved by almost all Grenadians. And you can't put a man like that on the house arrest. The people are going to come and rescue him. Then the dynamic of that, because the party then becomes the enemy of the people, and the people with no now direction. Morris was exhausted and ill, right? So they're not under any guidance. They are available to be manipulated by all kinds of voices. So they take him up to the military barracks. God knows why. They had nothing to do up there, right? It was just a move because we're out. We need to march somewhere, so we're going to march up there, right? And so consequences followed from the fact that the people had intervened with now no direction, because Morris wasn't able to give it and wasn't even seeking to give it. I'm not sure he particularly wanted to be rescued. In that way,
I take your point. So then, because for me now, okay, so when Elder Selwyn Strawn came, right, there was a lot of talk about the circumstances under which, or what was inspiring Maurice Bishop to go back on this agreement, on this decision. I recall some conversation about threats of assassination, and all kinds of different things. Now, I'm yet to read Elder Bernard Coard's book yet, so forgive me for that. But what is your impression of the motivation for going back on the decision?
Right. Look, Morris and Bernard were close, they from childhood. Bernard describes that, I think, perfectly accurately. It's true. And they knew each other's strengths and they knew each other's weakness. And Morris knew what Bernard had to offer. So in that moment within the party of that pure excitement, when they said, we have to bring this man back, and not just bring him back to the old position, but bring him back to the joint leadership, it persuaded Morris for a moment, right? But it had ramifications. And the ramifications were that Morris was in effect admitting publicly within the party to a certain failure of delivery and of discipline and so on. So he was now opening himself up to every move that rising Bernard would have been able to make and would have made. He's a very ambitious and bright, able, dynamic man. I am sure the next step would have been for Bernard to be maximum leader and Morris secondary, and then to some kind of drift. And I believe, and this is what is implied, although it's not quite said, by Bernard, is that Morris, having agreed, went abroad. He went to Eastern Europe and he went to Cuba. And Bernard
and China, I believe. Did he not go to China as well?
don't know about China at that
No,
moment.
I'm thinking something else. I'm thinking of Nkrumah. Sorry, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah,
go ahead.
yeah. Okay. We must mix up those two. Good.
No. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. No problem. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So, Eastern Europe and
Mhm.
Cuba,
Mhm.
and what Bernard appears to think, and he says and implies in the book. I'll tell you what he says.
Mhm.
He says that by this time, factions are developing. There are people who had always been indisciplined, who are now allying themselves to Morris and saying that this is a coup against Morris. Right? These people are in Grenada. He names them. Right? He names them. So all of that is happening, and he thinks and implies and says that these people are making moves against what is now effectively the majority of the leadership.
Yes.
Right? And then the additional factor comes in where it appears to be the case that Morris passes through Cuba and he must tell Fidel, or so Bernard appears to think, what is happening. And Fidel strengthens him, and he strengthens him in what Bernard thinks is his mistake. Morris is not Fidel, right? Yeah. He's got lots of charisma and so on. But in terms of organization and capacity for work and all of that and more, they're differently. And effectively, Bernard is saying that Fidel helps to persuade Morris that what Morris has to return and try to resume trying to be is Cuba's Fidel. And in the process, he breaks this big party principle, which is that a decision has been taken, it is subject to democratic centralism, and he's opposing it.
Right.
And yeah, he's sitting in his house, he's not doing anything, right? He don't make no calls to nobody to come and rescue him, right? The people who know, and it's all rumor, what is happening. He's undoubtedly on the house arrest, but the dynamics of it, the party is very small, right? So thousands of people are hearing stuff about what they're doing to a leader, and then go arrest, they go and rescue a leader, and then the thing escalates and escalates.
All right. So my final question of this bit, because I want to go on to talk about some of the achievements of the revolution, but the role of General Austin, appears to. So because I know of like his role in the whole thing appears to contribute to some level of confusion and destabilization, partly because of a radio broadcast that he's supposed to have done, whereby he's declared what's a curfew or something like that, and anybody found say again?
A 4-day curfew. My Grenadian friend says, my Grenadian friend says you can't do 4-day or even 2-day curfew in a society like that, where people have to go and look after them, go to and go.
All that kind of stuff, right? But is it also not the case that in announcing this 4-day curfew, that he said words to the effect that anybody found on the street will be shot, or something like that?
There was a threat of that kind, and people. Gus John's father died in those circumstances, and there were issues about how he was to be buried. You remember that Brother Gus came to that session and spoke. All of that stuff is part of the picture. Now, what was Hudson Austin doing? What he was doing, right? He wasn't the deputy, so Bernard really should have been the man appointed as head in that moment. Probably for tactical reasons, they thought that the army man might be better placed to carry it off, and so he was deputed to do it, and he did it in the way that army men, even if they have politics, tend to do, which is that you do it hardline and you try to frighten people back into line, and you threaten to shoot them and kill them and so on. All of which happened, or was threatened. Yeah. So Hudson Austin is part of the attempt by the majority of the leadership to manage a situation which was by then unmanageable. Because once they put Morris under house arrest, there was no way they were going to win that encounter with the people, which was going to be provoked by that action. No way.
And here's where I find it, because for me, it seems to me that there were any number of infinitely more beneficial ways to address that issue with the people. This is not about Bishop now, but declaring, curfew, and if you're found on the street, you're going to be shot. It seems to contribute to the environment in which seven people are shot down. What I'm saying?
Wait. No. The curfew was declared after the shooting, if my memory is serving me right. It was at the end of that day when there's not just now the mess of managing the people, but the mess of managing the death of 7 of the leaders and people dying in droves as they jump off over the wall. So it's at that point that comes about. It's not
before.
It's not a declaration. It's not a declaration as part of going and arresting Morris. It's another stage of trying now to manage the impossible, because you've already caused the death of all of those people, and you've already and people think that you have ordered the killing of Morris and Jackie and those others, and so they are in an impossible situation. I repeat, I don't think they're ever going to win by that. Yeah.
So is there any? Because we've been back and forth about these things for decades. I'm sure
yes, indeed.
Right.
Growing up.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So, but in respect of, because many people have been back and forth between charging Bernard Coard and his faction with some level of culpability, varying levels of culpability, but also suggesting, well, actually that is flawed. Yes, they made mistakes, but we really should be targeting our angst and our blame, so to speak, at the American government. Yeah. What is the evidence of the American government's involvement prior to the formal invasion? You know what I'm saying?
That's what we don't have,
right?
Because that's the kind of stuff that they don't leak, and that they keep secret. But they undoubtedly had spies and agent provocateurs inside of that situation. I'm going to say it out loud, but I never trusted Morris's press secretary.
Okay.
The real person, right? And I think that the US had spies and activists inside of their clothes. You have people who call themselves Marxists and call themselves nationalists, but are really agents of the enemy, sometimes paid and sometimes not paid. And so we don't have any way yet of knowing what really happened. Perhaps in 100 years' time or 50 years' time, it will all emerge. But crucially, once they put Morris under house arrest, and they should never have done that because of his popularity, the people's love of him, that was bound to put the people, the party, in direct confrontation with the government, and it had every possibility of the party being forced to turn the army's guns on the people. All of that was built into the notion that Morris had broken a big party rule. Let us deal with him, and the way we deal with him is So all of them messed up. What I'm satisfied with is that there is no evidence that those people ordered Morris's murder.
I understand that. The rest of the Caribbean now. How did the rest of the Caribbean relate to Grenada during the revolutionary period?
Okay, that's a good question, and the answer is they related to the Grenadian Revolution in accordance with their politics, right? So in the immediately after the revolution,
Mm-hmm.
the Americans called on everybody to boycott and disrupt and so on. Trinidad allowed a boat race between Trinidad and Grenada. It was a famous event. I don't know if it's still happening, to go ahead.
Yes,
And
yes.
Trinidad never lifted a finger against the Grenada government. Similarly, Bernard, who I'm not a fan of, gave some support to the government, or at least never went with the American line on the government.
Mm-hmm.
The same applies to Jamaica up until Manley was voted out or shot out of office in, was it about October 1980, whenever that 80 election was in Jamaica. And then you have the other people, the other side of the equation. Siaga, who came to power in Jamaica in that same moment, 1980, and the lady in Dominica, Mrs. Charles, and Mr. Adams in Barbados. And they were the right wing of our regional leadership from long before this, and they acted in accordance with their right wing predilections. And Mrs. Charles went and supported the American invasion. There's a picture of her standing with Reagan like a poodle, and so on. Young Adams was disgraceful. He authorized and praised and welcomed all of that. And there was no argument in his favor. This is a circumstance in which the British Queen and the British Prime Minister said that the Americans had done wrong. And their poodles in the Caribbean are saying, no, they never do anything wrong, and we welcome it, and they rescued medical students, all kind of foolishness. So,
from my understanding, though, sorry, not to interrupt you, but from my understanding, Thatcher's vexation was more due to the fact that Reagan never informed her before making the move.
For whatever reason, my point still stands, which is that there were certain protests that came from here.
Yes.
Against the invasion, even it was that you never tell we. While Caribbean leaders who should have been defending the interest of the Caribbean people, and a key interest that we have is not to allow or to speak in favor of America treating us as its backyard, which is a big example of what they were doing in 1983 in Grenada.
Yes. Case in point, then a quick point, and I got another question on the achievement.
And hold on, I've got another point I want to bring up.
Okay.
I don't know if we can see that. Oh, where is it? Yeah, the one in terms of.
Okay. No. Right.
Okay, you can see that.
Yeah, I can see it, and I understand what's being asked. It was the U.S. to summarize the question or interpret the question. What the question appears to be asking is, was the U.S. seriously worried about Russian influence and all of that? Yeah. The Americans were, they always are, and that worry of theirs manifests in some strange ways. So that, for example, the Americans, who should have known, because I found this out as a research student, that Michael Manley was a fundamental anti-communist. Because he asked them for half a percentage more on the bauxite levy, decided to convert him into a communist when all he was doing was a little democratic socialist thing in Jamaica. And all of that stuff that came at Manley is completely unnecessary. It never represented any threat whatsoever, either to the Jamaican ruling circle and certainly not to American interests in the Caribbean. Never in a million years did Michael. And yet, look what they did to Jamaica. So, back to the Americans in Grenada. In what I said, and this is in the record, a month after the Grenada Revolution, they sent their representative to Grenada to warn the Grenadian revolutionary leadership against certain courses of action. Don't associate with Manley, don't go down Manley's road, and don't associate with Fidel. And obviously, had nothing to do with the Soviet Union, right? So that was a worry right from the start, because that is how the Americans read anything that's even vaguely not in their interest. Now, their big double ploy at the end, just before the invasion, was to say that they had to rescue medical students. The medical students were not in any danger. That was complete bogus. And the other thing that they said was that what the Grenadian government was doing in making the airport was making an air base for Soviet for the Soviet aircraft air force in the Caribbean. Load of foolishness, right? Jamaica has one of those. Trinidad has one of those. Almost all of the little islands of the Caribbean now have international airports. That's how they get tourists directly into those places. Nothing to do with the Soviet Union or anything like that. So that's a load of foolishness. I don't know whether the Americans believed it or not, but they certainly put that argument. And the only big point, and it was included in my talk, is that on the basis that they needed, and they did, to defend themselves against America, against American invasion, the Grenada government did ask the Soviet Union for defensive weaponry. And the Soviet Union did give it in a bigger quantum than the Grenadians asked for, and more than ever arrived in Grenada, because it ended up waiting in Cuba for the Grenadians to train and be ready to receive all the stuff that none of them had any training to use.
Interesting. Anything else?
Okay, just before you come, because time's coming up. So I said the last 5 minutes. Yeah,
okay, cool. Yeah,
5 more minutes.
No problem. Thank you for the opportunity once again.
Okay.
I want to ask now about how successful do you think the organizations of the people were in Grenada? And I mean, because we know that, like, there's a brilliant speech, by the way, for anybody listening who hasn't heard it, of Morris Bishop speaking in America months before he was assassinated at Hunter College. There's a shorter version and then there's a longer version, but the longer version is not as good quality, but it goes into more detail about the revolution and its successes, and its challenges. In fact, it's a very real speech in terms of detailing the challenges that they were having as well. But they had zonal councils, they had parish councils, worker parish councils, farmer council, you know what I'm saying, all kinds of, a national women's organization, a national youth organization, institutions that whereby people could come and speak to, or have ministers in the high realms of the government speak, all kinds of different things, right? So in your observation and study, how effective were those institutions? All that sounds good, that sounds beautiful. But how effective do you think those institutions actually were on the ground?
All of them were real, and that was part of the crisis, because running and managing that stuff requires person power. Those ministers and people have to go to those meetings and explain stuff to people. That's very time consuming and exhausting. Bernard and them talk about that in the book. It really was difficult at a certain level. So that's to those participative and participatory elements of their social mobilization. All of that was real, and it was problematic. But there were other things about the revolution. They had reduced unemployment significantly. They had increased education significantly. They had addressed whole heap of health needs that had previously been completely neglected. They were sending students abroad for education. They had programs around pipe-borne water and rural roads and all of that stuff. They had stuff around trying to make sure that people's fruit doesn't get wasted, but it gets canned. They had programs to send mangoes. I bought Grenadian mangoes here that came up and was distributed through the High Commission and so on. So it was real and absolutely beneficial stuff to the Grenadian people that was streets ahead of anything that happened under Geary, who just took the money and put it in his pocket or bought hotels or whatever with it, or went on expeditions to find unidentified flying objects or whatever. That's the level that he was at. So there's another point worth making. The Grenada Revolution didn't approach managing the economy on the basis of Marxist Marxist dogmatism.
I was going to ask. Beautiful.
They didn't, for example, nationalize anything, right? The things that they nationalized, and I said it in the talk, were the hotels that Geary had illegally got hold of. They nationalized his property, and they had a dispute with must be a Coke bottling plant, and they nationalized that, and perhaps one other thing. But they left domestic capitalists to do their thing. And I spent time with a Grenadian man who had money, right? And he said, "Me, no, I'm not worried about those boys. I know them. They're not they're not troubling me." So, and that connects back to one of your earlier questions about this hardline Marxism and whether it wasn't really about that at all. They had a very moderate, slow planning, almost social democratic approach to economic development and to the management of the economy. Right? They were going to do it via tourism. They were going to house people. They were going to educate people. And so on and so forth. They were doing about taking away people's property. In any event, there's next to no bourgeois property in Grenada. There were a few peasants who had a little land, and a few persons who owned a hotel. Well, a big capital wasn't there anyway. You're going to nationalize and subvert private property. Marxism isn't actually against private property. It's against bourgeois property. That is to say, large-scale property that functions on the basis of the exploitation of either peasantry or workers.
Final question then.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, correct.
Final question. In putting this back into the context of neo-colonialism, it appears to me the fundamental, or one of the most fundamental contradictions here is that Grenada was in the figurative sense a revolutionary island surrounded by neo-colonialist states, and I'm thinking in one instance in terms of the roles that armies play in neo-colonialist states. Like the Jamaican army's never been deployed anywhere to defend Jamaican people, no. And so it appears
what they do is kill Jamaican people daily.
Exactly. So the question then becomes then, what needs to be reconfigured? This is probably the only question, or the biggest question, in terms of our Africans in the Caribbean experience or in the Americas experience to protect gains from revolutions such as these. Because it appears to me that no island can do it by itself.
Well, we in the Caribbean have to recognize, right, we have to operate and defend our class interests, and we have to defend our racial interests. So all of those places in the Caribbean that have African majorities should be organizing as Africans in those places. Frequently, we're in a place where in the majority. Jamaica is one where there's actually no Africanist ideology more than so officially, and Africans' interest as African people isn't really being properly defended by the structure that is there, which has elements of the pigmentocracy, that color hierarchy, and element of pro-imperialist stuff. The Jamaican government some months ago gave an honor to the man who runs the Dominican Republic at the time when the Dom Rep government was being massively brutal to our brethren in Haiti.
Yes.
The Jamaican government some years ago, my friend who's died, who ran Liberty Hall, was part of a set of people to bring Winnie Mandela to Jamaica. And somebody in the Ministry of Tourism, who was supposed to contribute a small amount to it, said they are not supporting a criminal to come to Jamaica, right? They had no idea about how the criminalization of Winnie had arisen and the extent to which the ANC itself and apartheid had been party to criminalizing Winnie in the way in the way that they did, and their response to it was racist and backward, right? So there is stuff that we have to do as African communities, recognizing our specific interests, analyzing what that is and how it is to be expressed in those particular places, and then because we're in a region where most of the places have populations like us in Jamaica, we should be getting together on that basis and mobilizing and organizing all kinds of things, as well as in class terms, working out policies of how to defeat these neo-colonial regimes. In Jamaica, 3 weeks or so ago, it is said that the Jamaican people voted back in the Jamaica Labour Party. That is the most backward thing that the people could do. But I mean, a whole heap of them have a vote, but it happened. Yeah. And so we have, as Africans in the Caribbean and as African working people in the Caribbean, enough work to do around these issues, around the necessary mobilization and finding effective ways to defeat neocolonialism, because that's killing us, literally.
Give thanks to the Cecil. Give thanks. Give thanks.
Good to talk to you, my brother.
Oh,
I was trying. Right, I was trying. After you put up my talk on Nkrumah,
Yes.
I tried all kinds of ways to ask you what response that was getting, and none of you. I never got any reply.
I apologize. But did you email me?
I tried everything.
Okay, I'll look for it. I'll look for it and I'll respond. Yeah. Give thanks.
Okay. Yes.
Okay.
I'm finished. Thank you, brothers.
Okay, brothers Cecil and Shakara. Yeah, thanks. We are completely run out of time. Just before I hand over to Ndugomani, there was just one thing I wanted to get in.
Yes.
Because I came across a picture with Morris Bishop and Simura Michelle.
Yes.
So it's just to end. What was the relationship with the regime in Grenada at the time, and you can say progressive revolutionary African leaders?
No, all progressive Caribbean people, Walter Rodney, Morris Bishop, even Michael Manley, have good and strong relations with progressive Africans and progressive African liberation forces. And in 1980 to 1983, 1979 to 83, some of those territories were still not liberated. And so I think Mozambique was by then, but those connections were real. And there's Mali had an impact in Zimbabwe. Yeah. Buju Banton, believe it or not, I went to Namibia. It's a different thing. Some years ago, in about 2005, and I met youths in Namibia who knew Buju Banton's politics, and it's been complicated by his subsequent problems, but they knew what our singers and players of instruments were doing, and our left politicians knew and had connections into that progressive and liberation stream in Africa. So I'm not surprised there's a picture of Morris and Michelle.
All right. Yeah, it was just to get that in, because it was just to...
Yes. Actually, one of Shakara's questions addressed that.
Okay. Yeah, so unfortunately, time's beaten us. Quickly, how 2 hours go. when you're enjoying yourself. So, as usual, to end this session, I'll now hand over to Ndugo Mani, who will again change the vibrations for us. Yes, Ndugo?
Asante sana.
Okay.
Asante sana, MZ Cecil, for a very enlightening, as usual, conversation and historical perspective. It can't be missed or taken for granted that we have someone in our community who actually met these people, first-hand experience. This isn't from a book. This is from long years of revolutionary experience, and can actually talk and speak with that first-hand knowledge. So we do thank you, Elder Cecil, for everything you've done and all your analysis to help us understand the negatives of our struggle. Okay, so as the Ndugu says, I'm going to end the session with our ritual. So I'm going to share my screen again. So let's see, yep. Okay,
Yes,
just let me go. Can you see that in Ndugu Tahaka?
Yeah, I've just pressed
okay.
it.
Right, my internet connection is a little spotty, so
yeah,
I'm hearing you kind of in and out. So, so I'm sure you can hear me, but I'm not so sure I can hear you.
I can hear you fine.
Okay, fine.
Okay, I'm trying to bring it up, but yeah, it's coming up now. It's
coming
slow.
up, yeah. Okay, it's slow, yeah. It's from my side. It's from my side.
All right. Okay.
Oh, okay. So, as I said before, we're going to end on our ritual, the Marbar Daliko Ya Nishati, and as we called the powers and principles that are underlying all of existence and the ancestors into this realm to assist us, to guide us, to open up our consciousness, and of course the ever-present all within us, our higher selves. We called that we made that connection. We now wish to bring this ritual to an end, and we'll do that at the same time as thinking in gratitude for their presence, for that connection, and that they go back to their realms and assist us with manifesting our objectives. Okay, so it's most important for us to understand that we don't manifest what we want, but we manifest what we believe. And it's important for us to inculcate and deeply understand and focus upon what we wish to manifest. In order to do that, again, I will play the triangle chime 4 times. So for growth, health, and foundation, and let the vibration go around you, over you, and through you. And we close our connection in this physical space, wherever we are, with the powers that we called upon. So I now begin. So please, if you wish to take part, sit straight.
Oh, Iman is dropped out his connections.
I've lost Brother Iman. Let me go, my brother.
Okay, then.
I'll see you on the next occasion. I hope you're
all right then. Since we've lost him with us, and just to say to everybody, thank you again for tuning in this week, and we'll see you again next Sunday at 6 p.m. So quite hearing.
Thank you, my brother.
Okay.
And